Good afternoon. On behalf of the Terry Lectures Committee, I would like to thank you for joining us for the second installment of the 2015 Terry Lectures. I am Jean Thompson Black, Senior Executive Editor at Yale University Press. The Dwight H. Terry Lectureship, which was established in 1905 by a gift from Dwight Harrington Terry of Bridgeport, Connecticut, invites preeminent scholars in religion, the sciences, and philosophy to address issues concerning the ways in which science and philosophy inform religion and religion's application to human welfare. We are delighted that Janet Browne, Aramont Professor of the History of Science at Harvard University, is our 2015 lecturer. At Harvard, Professor Browne teaches the history of biology, including the history of evolutionary theory. Her interests range widely over the life sciences, botany, the history of gardens, collecting, expeditions, museums, and natural history. She has been at Harvard since 2006 and is currently chair of the History of Science Department. Previously, she taught at the Wellcome Trust Center for the History of Medicine at University College London and was an associate editor of the early volumes of the Correspondence of Charles Darwin in Cambridge, England. She has been editor of the British Journal for the History of Science and president of the British Society for the History of Science. In 2002, she completed a 2-volume biography of Charles Darwin that integrated Darwin's science with his life and times. She is vice president of the History of Science Society and chair-elect of the section on History and Philosophy of Science for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Today, Professor Browne will present her second lecture in the 3-part series, Becoming Darwin, History, Memory, and Biography. In the first lecture, which we enjoyed on Tuesday, November 3, she considered the subject of Charles Darwin as an economist of nature. Her presentation painted a portrait of Darwin as an accountant and one for whom the minute details of household accounts and personal finance greatly influenced all other aspects of his thinking, values, and scientific pursuits. This perspective also situated his theory of evolution by natural selection with 19th century economic theory and moral values. Today, her lecture will focus on the long tradition of biographies of Darwin. One of the most pleasurable aspects of the Terry Lectures is the opportunity to converse with the lecturer informally. Earlier this week, over a lunch conversation, Professor Browne revealed that at one time in her life, and before she undertook her graduate training in history of science, she was engaged in the business of selling antiquarian books. In the course of sorting through a collection of books and other print materials the business had acquired, she discovered a pamphlet with handwritten notes which, upon further investigation, were indeed annotations by Charles Darwin. That pamphlet today resides in the archives of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. At the conclusion of today's lecture, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. The lectures are being videoed for subsequent web transmission, so if you would like to ask a question, please use one of the microphones available. We then invite you to attend a reception to be held at the other end of the corridor here at the Whitney Humanities Center. In closing, could I please remind you to turn off or silence cell phones? And now, please join me in welcoming back Janet Browne.
Thank you very much, Jean, and thank you all for either returning or making your first visit to this series of lectures. Welcome to you all. It's so nice to see you. I'm going to start straight in without too much preamble. Several of my colleagues, who I can see here in the audience today, have probably seen this image before, but I think it's so unusual that it's worth another outing. It's a photograph, as you can see. It was published in the 1970s, and it purports to show a photographic image of Charles Darwin's ghost taking a midnight stroll. And according to the photographer, who seems to be perfectly genuine, he can be seen in hat and cloak with his walking stick and his telltale beard. So please, if you see him, I really would want to know. Your guess is absolutely as good as mine. I have shown it before and people have made suggestions, and they have suggested perhaps he's here. Perhaps he's here. Perhaps he's here. And that leaves out all of this side of the image. It's very perplexing. It may be a hoax. I mean, it probably is a hoax. But it does pose a very intriguing visual puzzle. And it also calls into our belief systems, generally speaking, is that some of us will be willing to find him there, and some of us won't. So I'm dealing with the afterlives of a prominent scientist in this talk today. And the afterlives of someone as prominent as Darwin are usually much more obvious than the possibilities we see here. I'm going to be following very appreciatively in the footsteps of a number of scholars who have worked on commemorative activities, biographical traditions, and celebratory occasions in the sciences and in other places. And I'm going to be calling attention to the manner in which Darwin has been constructed and reconstructed through a number of different biographies written in English. There were obviously different Darwins for different circumstances, each one moulded to fit the occasion. And in the previous lecture on Tuesday, I tried to show something of Darwin's character and the way that he depended on creating order and stability out of a huge variety of data. I mentioned his ability in financial investment, his account book mentality, his compulsion to list things, and his sense that economic probity was also a moral virtue. And tonight I want to focus on something of the same theme of virtue on the written accounts of Darwin's life. And next week I want to be looking more at the visual records of Darwin's life. Bernie Lightman and I have shown in recent essays that there have been around 30 or so biographies of Darwin that are strictly speaking biographies. There's many hundreds, perhaps even more than 1,000 studies of Darwin's works, and often they use his life in order to engage with his works. But a classic biography that we all understand what shape that might take, there's actually only been about 30 since his death in 1882. 30 is somewhat more than Isaac Newton, but considerably less than Marie Curie. So we have an individual here who has a substantial biographical tradition, but it's not overwhelmingly huge. One leading feature that bears special consideration that I'm going to turn to today is the way that Darwin's moral life was presented by successive authors. Now, actually, Darwin was his own first biographer. Whilst he was in his 60s, he wrote a document called by him Recollections of the Development of My Mind and Character. Here's the table of contents from the first manuscript version of this. It's actually, sorry, I shouldn't have said the first manuscript version. There's a very scrappy, heavily altered and annotated version that was the first version that was written over several years, beginning in 1876. This is the clean copy that Darwin unusually wrote out for himself instead of paying the village schoolmaster to do it for him. That's Darwin's handwriting. You won't be able to read too much of it from the distance that you are at, but you see it says table of contents. What does it say? It says, from my birth to going to Cambridge is the first one. Cambridge life, voyage of the Beagle, etc., etc. So he began it in May 1876, at the same time as he was writing a biographical memoir of his grandfather, Dr. Erasmus Darwin, the poet, evolutionary thinker and medical man. And that memoir of Erasmus Darwin, which Darwin very much enjoyed researching and writing, plus the exciting news of the first grandchild on the way, encouraged him to begin an essay of his own. He took no care over style. He didn't bother to pursue episodes that escaped his memory. He didn't check dates. And he let his narrative move forward in a very straightforward line towards his different achievements, principally the origin of species. Because it was not meant to be read by anyone other than the family. And as a result, the work embodied many of the charms and eccentricities and oddities of an English gentleman at home. It was very polite, it was very considerate, it was amusingly self-deprecating, and yet Darwin seems to have been unable or unwilling to delve too far beneath the surface. A much more demanding editor or author might have asked himself much more penetrating questions. But in choosing which memories to record and in selecting the anecdotes that he gave very freely, he was constructing himself in the way that he wanted to be, in the way that he wanted to know himself and in the way that he wanted to be remembered. Roy Pascal, the literary scholar, noted more than 30 years ago that scientists often feel that personal experiences are somehow irrelevant to the story of their scientific achievement. And we may have scientists in the audience who might want to feed back on that question in question time. Personal experiences perhaps are irrelevant to the story of their achievement, since it's the achievement who defines who they are. It doesn't mean that scientists have a lesser emotional life, but that they retrospectively see their lives playing out towards the scientific achievement, and they don't see that there's much purpose in putting in all the other details of their private lives. So Darwin evidently had this point of view, this sense of himself. He saw the idea of evolution by natural selection as the main purpose, retrospectively, of his life. And for the most part, he described himself as a series of books. And towards the end of his memoir, Darwin did try to estimate his character, reflecting on the issues of that many inquirers had asked him, but also particularly on the questions set before him in the questionnaire that I showed on Tuesday, sent to him by Francis Galton, asking about his character. But he wasn't introspective by nature, nor did he find it appropriate to mention the financial affairs that I discussed in great detail on Tuesday. The big silences in Victorian autobiography were sex and money. Nobody talked about sex or money in their autobiographies, even though they formed the topics of almost every novel of the period. It was just not polite to do that. What's less noticed, perhaps, some of you will be familiar with this autobiography, what's less noticed is the way that Darwin emphasized his own personal effort, presenting himself as a man committed to the ethos of self-help, a part of his identity that evidently drew on the contemporary ideals of character, self-determination, enterprise that were encountered in Samuel Smiles's books of the period. Darwin seems to have believed that everything he achieved had been the result of his own industry. Looking back, he reckoned he had learned nothing at school. Nothing from his father, who's here on the left in this image. Nothing from his father, who was a very intelligent medical man. Robert Waring Darwin, on the left there, considered Darwin a very ordinary boy, and it's that phrase that Darwin remembers in his 60s, early 70s, to record about his father. He claims he gained nothing from lectures at two great universities, Cambridge and Edinburgh. He claimed that in Edinburgh, as a student, he had listened to Robert Grant's eloquent advocacy of the evolutionary ideas of Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, And Darwin says in his autobiography, without any effect on my mind. Similarly, he stated that the evolutionary views of his grandfather, Dr. Erasmus Darwin, who's here on the right, one generation further back, Erasmus Darwin had been a very prominent evolutionary thinker and writer, and Darwin similarly says that his grandfather's evolutionary views produced no effect on me. So there's a decidedly self-congratulatory air to this. Darwin couldn't even believe that the subject of evolution had been in the air when he published. We know absolutely that that's a false memory. So all these opinions conveyed a commitment to personal autonomy. This was the age of individuality, of laissez-faire. Darwin was writing a kind of capitalist autobiography where his everyday traits were turned by skill and personal effort into assets. It was full of masculine assumptions about the world of work and personal effort, positive intellectual activity. Darwin's moments of uncertainty, the enormous efforts made by his friends and his family to support him, the generosity of other colleagues, which historians know about from the very large archival record, all went unmentioned by him. We also look in vain for a moment of epiphany, as might be found in other autobiographical reflections, such as Rousseau's Confessions or John Henry Newman's Apologia pro vita sua, Apology for My Life. There is, of course, Darwin's self-description of his delightful self-description of his carefree innocence and his zest for collecting natural history specimens before and during the Beagle voyage. He always believed, as indeed we still do today, that the Beagle voyage was the turning point in his life. It was the voyage that made him what he became subsequently. And also in this autobiography, he did attempt to explain his religious beliefs. He was by then the celebrated author of On the Origin of Species. He was the presumed skeptic who had overturned Victorian ideas about Adam and Eve. He felt obliged to describe what he, at that point, thought he had become in religious terms. So his personal loss of faith was described by him as a gradual transition from an early, relatively low-key Unitarian family training to a state of mind where he constantly questioned the role of an interventionist God in nature. He wrote with some humor about the original plan to become a clergyman, but he recorded that when he was faced by a family tragedy, which was the death of his oldest daughter, Anne, in 1851 at the age of 10, her unexpected death from illness, surely we all now think wiped out the last shreds of his belief in conventional Christianity. Yet, I do think it's fair to say that Darwin never really rejected the idea of an ultimate divinity. And he was very glad when Thomas Henry Huxley, his friend, as our colleague, the late Frank Turner, was one of the first to notice, when Huxley coined the word agnostic. This helped a large number of scientists in the 1870s, 1880s, to put a word onto what they thought about these big issues. It's a word that simply expresses they didn't know. They didn't know what to believe. There was no evidence that fell into the normal domain of scientific evidence. So agnostic as a word was something that Darwin tended to use a lot about himself after 1870, when Huxley brought it to his attention. And on the theme of Darwin's religious beliefs, you may well have seen this astonishing letter which came up for sale in September this year in Bonham's, New York, in which Darwin very astringently states his point of view. And so here you'll see, I'm sorry to have to inform you that I do not believe in the Bible as a divine revelation. and therefore not in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. It's pretty terse, isn't it? And I think if we put this in historical context, it is actually amazing to see Darwin say this kind of thing, and indeed on a letter that is up for sale for collectors. It fetched the highest price ever for a Darwin letter, $197,000. It was written, it's been known about for some time, but it's not been on the market for forever. It was written in 1880 in response to a young Christian lawyer called Francis McDermott, who told Darwin he could not and would not read The Origin of Species unless he knew that the author was a believer, both in the Bible as the revealed word of God and in Jesus Christ. So this possibly explains the wording of the letter and a little bit of the exasperation, because nobody likes to be sent a letter saying, well, I'm not going to read you unless you can tell me something more about your religious faith. But please notice, he doesn't deny the existence of a divinity. And in his autobiography, he said that he rejected all the sort of apparatus of Christianity, the churches, the baptism, the 39 articles in those days that you were meant to sign. And in his autobiography, he said that he probably deserved to be called a theist. He was very concerned about deity, about free will, about the apparent existence of design in nature, and he explored these topics, these very deep and difficult topics, in correspondence with the American botanist Asa Gray, and also touchingly in a few letters exchanged between him and his wife Emma. And Darwin mentions those letters from his wife also in his autobiography as to how he read them, wasn't quite able to conform with her wishes. And there's one, I unfortunately don't have an image of it, there's one letter from his wife that he has obviously kept, because it's in the archive still, it's all folded up, it's all kind of dirty around the folds, and along one margin he's written, know that when I've died, that I have kissed and cried over this. So it's very sweet, it's very touching, it's very personal. It's moments like that that historians feel privileged to be in an archive, when you get a real insight into someone's private life. He couldn't go as far as his wife Emma in belief, but I think he didn't ever quite give up a sense of something divine in nature. So he was always sensitive to his wife's belief in established doctrine, although she too was brought up rather laxly as a Unitarian. And she mentions in her own manuscripts that her own faith declined as she grew older. Here she is in old age. She was, I think, not a member of the theological police that she's often painted as in some of the biographies that I might be mentioning today. So this is the story as Darwin more or less told it. And my question now is, how did the biographers tell it? The foundation document in the biographical tradition is the Life and Letters of Charles Darwin, a 3-volume book published in 1887, 5 years after he died, prepared by Darwin's third son, Frank. It was published fairly rapidly, only 5 years, as I said, in order to ensure that the family kept a really close agency in regulating how his intellectual legacy was to be understood. And immediately after Darwin's death, the 5 sons began soliciting papers and correspondence from his friends. They were then catapulted into action. They hadn't been planning to move so fast, but they were catapulted into action by a pamphlet published the year after by Edward Aveling, the socialist philosopher, stating that Darwin was an atheist. And the boys wrote to each other in some agitation, who knew what might be next. Those who opposed religion in those days often took Darwin as their inspiration, and they expected his support for their cause, which was a role that he had very firmly rejected in his lifetime. So the issue became more problematic for the Darwin family almost immediately afterwards, when the journalist and anthropologist Grant Allen, the Canadian anthropologist, published a quick and easy biography drawing on his acquaintance with Thomas Henry Huxley and the abundant Darwinian literature that was already circulating. So Frank, who had served as Darwin's scientific secretary and botanical co-author for more than a decade, felt that he should hurry through an authorized biography, that the family should produce it. And his own correspondence is rather interesting about this, about the wish to honor his father and preserve his memory, even to the point of some self-identification. And I just returned to this image of Francis because he looks a bit like Darwin, but all the sons looked a bit like Darwin, and I'll show you that in just a moment. But he's wearing Darwin's cape that they had given him as a birthday present when he was 70, not so many years previously. So it's quite, I think it's a little bit worrying myself, but it's quite interesting that he chooses to be painted by his friend William Rothenstein as Darwin. But anyway, Francis, more than any other of the family, made his reputation on being Charles Darwin's son. And the heritage industry today would probably call that being a professional descendant. But he did write a very nice life and letters, which I'll come to in just a moment. As an aside, it's such a pity that the Beinecke is closed at the moment, but there's a very remarkable letter in the Beinecke Library here, written by Darwin's daughter, Henrietta, to a woman called Camilla Ludwig, who was a governess to the Darwin children, to Henrietta, when she was a girl, to inform Camilla of Darwin's death. And Camilla had been a great favorite of Charles Darwin's, because she translated great wadges of German scientific work for him. And those translations have been in the Darwin Archive, handwritten translations, for many, many years, nobody knowing who had been the translator. But it's from this letter in the Beinecke that we know now that it was Camilla, the governess, who did it for him. And he was very, he liked Camilla Ludwig very much. So Francis Darwin here brought great personal knowledge, literary ability, and strong scientific sympathy to the life and letters of Charles Darwin. And his volumes, although it's a completely conventional genre, were in fact innovative in revealing quite a lot about the private man. The bulk of the book was letters, as the title suggests, and these offered behind-the-scenes insight into Darwin's work. And introductory chapters included reminiscences contributed by the family and friends, and there was an account by Francis of his father's working life. And these and the narrative arc in general contribute to the making of a scientific hero. Huxley, who was still alive, supplied a very vigorous chapter about the reception of the origin of species. There were lists of publications, there were portraits, there was honorary degrees, and an appendix giving the citation for Darwin's burial in Westminster Abbey. So it's a very complete account of the man's life. And Francis included Darwin's autobiographical memoir that I've been talking about. Much has been made of the way that this was edited down. The religious material was taken out. And the sons, the 5 sons, discussed the matter of publication in edited form quite extensively. And here are 3 of the sons without Francis, who we've already seen. This is in age order. George was older than Francis. And then there's Leonard. Francis comes in between George and Leonard. And then there's Horace, the youngest son. There are hardly any photographs of the oldest son, William Darwin, who is here pictured in considerably old age with his sister Henrietta. There's one member of the family who is very rarely photographed as well, Elizabeth Darwin, the daughter who doesn't feature in the historical record very much, certainly not in the photographic record. So at Emma Darwin's request, Darwin's wife requested that the boys should remove several sentences from Darwin's autobiography that talk about his loss of religious faith. Emma felt that the sentences expressed very contemptuous opinions on points of Christian doctrine. The boys were reluctant to do so. They took advice from Leslie Stephen, who was both a member of the same Bloomsbury set that they belonged to, but also editor of the British Dictionary of National Biography, and they took advice from Huxley, both of whom said, publish. But Emma Darwin was very firm, mother was very firm, and she specified that she didn't wish to upset family members or friends who might be offended. Or at least that's how she chose to present it. And the passage that caused the most trouble was as follows. It's Darwin's words. "I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. For if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, my brother, and almost all of my friends, the people who do not believe will be everlastingly punished, and this is a damnable doctrine." And Emma simply didn't want that to go public. So to remove this was certainly selective editing. The published book and its sequel, More Letters of Charles Darwin, and later Henrietta's account of her mother, Emma Darwin, these were the only sources that were available for many, many, many decades that gave anything about the private man. So in truth, Francis Darwin's account was really much more skilled than usually credited. He showed Darwin as a loving father and a friend, as a courteous correspondent, socially responsible, intellectually honest, and personally humble. Many of us who have encountered Darwin through this life and letters have come away with the same sense of Darwin as being a very upright and engaged and interesting person. As Francis Darwin painted it, these fine, simple qualities were crucial factors in Darwin's intellectual success. Nowadays, we can understand much of this emphasis on humility and honesty and the struggle with ill health that was well documented as the 19th century equivalents of the credit-building process that Stephen Shapin, the sociologist of science, talks about in the 17th century. So early biographers who used Francis Darwin's book as a source continued that theme. They emphasized the humility and the honesty and how that made Darwin a worthy contributor to science. Here is a quotation. "No words can be strong enough," said the American biographer George Woodbury, "to express the moral beauty of Darwin's character." Here's another one. "He was a marvelously patient and successful revolutionist of thought." That was George Bettany. "Enough of his character shone forth in his work to indicate the tenderness and goodness," said Archibald Geikie. "A life of singular purity," thought Charles Frederick Holder. It goes on and on and on. "Translucent truthfulness," said Henry Fairfield Osborn. So Darwin's virtuous character is, I think, really being put forward here as evidence for, it's an important ability, it's an important element in his ability to convince contemporaries of the validity of his proposals and of his own authority in the field, really. And most of all, Francis Darwin portrayed his father as a hard worker. And to showcase this mental labor was another important biographical move that took its impetus from the busy, productive, self-made man of the 19th century, as described by Samuel Smiles, who you see here, and the title page, a little fuzzy, I'm sorry, of his Self-Help, a book that was immensely widely distributed in Britain, for sure, during the middle years of the 19th century. It was published the same year as The Origin of Species. So these notions of industriousness contributed to new representations of science emerging at the end of the 19th century. The Christian themes of saintly dedication and austerity and humility were transferred to the man of science. Great achievers, just reflecting back on our Tuesday discussions, great achievers, said Smiles, were careful economists of time. And so Darwin was written about as an industrious man for the industrial age. He was described, much as he described himself, as completely dedicated to his work, entirely respectable and conscientious. And this is what Stefan Collini and Boyd Hilton, two Cambridge, England historians, call the idea of character in Victorian thought. It's an idea that enjoyed particular prominence in Britain at the end of the 19th century, that features everything I've been saying: self-restraint, perseverance, effort, courage in the face of adversity, and a heightened sense of duty. We can see all these qualities in Darwin. Contrast this with the motifs embedded in the lives of, let's say, Alexander von Humboldt or John Stuart Mill, that were published at much the same time, that rest far more on self-cultivation and openness to experience, a version of romanticism that prioritized the self. Hilton makes the point that the British sense of character, which I'm proud to say, recoils from romantic self-indulgence. Hilton makes the point that this reflected the wider cultural impact of evangelical Christianity and a vision of life as a perpetual struggle. And that's actually how these early biographies of Darwin present his life. It's a life of struggle. It's a life of that recoils from romantic self-indulgence. So these, I think, are much the same features as the financial integrity and the moral discipline that I was speaking about on Tuesday, where work was the chief sphere in which virtue was developed and displayed. So there's a very different Darwin emerging in the aftermath of World War I, as you could imagine. It was difficult for authors to continue in this same mold after the horrors and deaths experienced on the global scale of World War I. Hard work and virtue as the leading motifs gave way to a personal inner turmoil. The 1920s and the 1930s saw those authors who wrote in English, they turned towards examining the interior life of men and women, answering the new psychoanalytic call to acknowledge that the self is a many-sided thing, and a search for greater authenticity in representing real people. There was much consideration of life writing as a genre, taking its tone of voice from the Bloomsbury set, especially Lytton Strachey, Leslie Stephen, and Edmund Goss. And that appears most obviously in Britain in the writings of Virginia Woolf, who was a biographer at times, and Harold Nicholson, and in America in the writings of Gamaliel Bradford, who's a very interesting scholar, a Boston literary critic who advocated a new genre of psychography. Bradford wrote an excellent short biography of Darwin in 1917, and then after the war he expanded it in 1926, very much, almost a different book. And he was one of the first to ask the very modern question, what kind of man was Darwin? So devoted to his work and so secular, what kind of man was he? And Bradford tended to write books in threes, and Darwin was the second volume of a religious trilogy. the first part of which was a portrait of the American evangelist Dwight, while the closing one was a study of Christ. And he needed Darwin for the negative side, so to speak, for a denial of Christian revelation to put in the middle of his trio. And he sought and sought to find a crucial, central moment in Darwin's life that he could turn his psychography around, but he didn't find one. There was no moment in Darwin's life where he turned away from religion that's an epiphany. So Bradford, very profitably, began to wonder about the interaction between illness and creativity. And it is a very interesting biography. I do recommend it. The question of creativity featured as an issue elsewhere too during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Here is Nora Barlow, who was one of Darwin's granddaughters, continuing the family tradition of thinking about the grandfather and producing edited volumes about the grandfather. But Nora Barlow was a rather different young woman. She was a scientist researching plant breeding, Mendelian genetics, with William Bateson in Cambridge and in the John Innes Horticultural Institute, just north of Cambridge. She began in the 1930s to explore the origins of Darwin's evolutionary ideas, seeking to understand creativity and motive. She didn't write a biography, but she was very innovative in bringing unpublished manuscripts, which were family manuscripts that nobody else had access to, especially manuscripts from the Beagle voyage and Darwin's full, unedited autobiography to the public. So in this regard, Bradford and Barlow considered Darwin as one of the secular moderns. They publicized his loss of faith, and that fitted very neatly into what was thought to be the dawn of the new secular humanist age. It's about this time as well, after the Second World War, up until this time at least, the Darwin family themselves retained possession of all of Darwin's papers, books, and other kinds of things, furniture, everything. It was only in 1942, by an arrangement with the Pilgrim Trust, a big American charitable foundation, that the archive was acquired by Cambridge University Library in England. This archive included some 9,000 letters, the portfolios of notes, Darwin's books, the drafts of his books, his library, the autobiography, which we've been talking about, his notes on specimens. And, I'm sorry, here are some of the books. Here's a wonderful, it's Darwin's copy of Lyell's Principles of Geology that he took with him on the Beagle voyage. The collection included the famous notebooks in which Darwin made his first evolutionary speculations. You'll all be very familiar with this image from that bee notebook, which predates Darwin's understanding of natural selection, but he was certainly thinking evolutionary thoughts when he made this diagram. The Darwin Archive is a fabulous collection that was acquired during the end of the Second World War and was made available to the public in the University Library, the research public, from 1949. And that had a big impact on the way that Darwin was written about after that point. And the next flurry of biographies came with the 1959 centenary of publication of The Origin of Species. The ground was extremely ready to promote a different kind of Darwin, and as it turns out, this new Darwin was a very biological Darwin. The notes and the papers and the records that were now available enabled biologists to make a much more focused case for Darwin really being understood as a biologist. By then, the so-called evolutionary synthesis was accepted. It was worked out in previous decades, during the 40s mostly, by Ernst Mayr, Ledyard Stebbings, George Gaylord Simpson, Julian Huxley, and others. And you can see them here. I'll speak to this in just a moment. Betty Smokovitis has argued that the Darwin celebratory year of 1959 was perceived as an appropriate moment to affirm biology's unification under an evolutionary synthesis and make direct links back to Darwin as a magisterial ancestor figure who had put the theory of evolution by natural selection on the map. And this panel of evolutionary biologists convened at a meeting in Chicago to celebrate the centenary of the origin of species, and they are showing their solidarity for the evolutionary synthesis by sitting together. So they're not all friends, I have to say. And let's see now, Ernst Mayr is actually not, he is fifth on the left, yes, Ernst Mayr is here, but none of us can see the names on the labels. His label is actually here. This is the one that says Mayr, but this is Ernst Mayr. This is Julian Huxley. This is Sewell Wright. It's a very distinguished panel of biologists. The biologically trained authors that I wish to talk about just for one moment now naturally saw Darwin through biological eyes, and their interest focused on asserting that evolutionary theory was true and that Darwin's ideas, even though they were 100 years old, had an active place in current thought. Ernst Mayr, who wrote about Darwin's central position in the grand sweep of biological history in this book, The Growth of Biological Thought, Darwin has a key place in the middle of the history, which is a giant sweep of biology from Aristotle in ancient Greece to modern Harvard and Ernst Mayr. Howard Mellish and Alan Moorhead provided accessible studies of Darwin's observations on the Beagle voyage, and Arthur Keith, the prominent London surgeon and physical anthropologist, wrote a very well-received study called Darwin Revalued, claiming that it wasn't a biography as such because it was arranged thematically. Now, Keith was a celebrated scholar of the human fossil record. He lived for many years in a house next to Darwin's home, and here he is in Darwin's garden. Some of you will have come across Darwin's thinking path, the sandwalk, at the bottom of Darwin's garden. Here is Keith on the sandwalk, showing his appreciation for Darwin as a living biological thinker. Now, Keith is unfortunately better known today for being deceived by the Piltdown Man hoax, in which the jawbone of an orangutan was deliberately combined with the cranium of a fully developed modern human and called to be a missing link, an intermediary form between apes and human. Keith was completely hoaxed by this, and here he is in a rather wonderful image examining the skull with the panel of people who also endorsed the authenticity of this fossil, and he never recovered from the embarrassment. So with this freshly biologized Darwin, the Galapagos finches begin to take their place. If you've read The Origin of Species, which is not an easy book to tackle, the Galapagos finches aren't in there. Darwin doesn't really talk about them very much in any of his autobiographical recollections. They're really a product of the 1950s as part of Darwin's work. So the finches, as shown here in John Gould's beautiful illustrative materials, become part of the Darwin story through David Lack's work. David Lack described them as an exemplary case of adaptive radiation. As you can see here, the bills, well, perhaps you can't, the bills are all different shapes in this circle, and they radiate out from a presumed ancestral form. And here they are looking at some finches in a box. So Lack's book was actually first written in 1947 and then was reissued in 1961. And these materials, as explored by Lack, supported the view that Darwin's theory was, in all essentials, based on biological observations made in the Galapagos Islands. Lack's writings became the source for a widespread belief that Darwin had experienced a eureka moment in the archipelago, and that the possibility of such a moment fitted very well with contemporary notions about how science advanced. Different now, but it was very powerful in its day. And it's also very likely that the anniversary period, 1959, was instrumental in consolidating the notion that scientific ideas had at last conquered the religious opposition from the church. Julian Huxley's Living Thoughts of Darwin promoted Darwin as a rational scientific figure, the Newton of biology. So the younger Huxley, who you can see here, here is the young Julian Huxley with his grandfather, Thomas Henry Huxley, and here is Julian Huxley as an adult. Julian Huxley adopted his grandfather's pugnacious style and defended secularism vigorously through the 1950s and 60s. And as the keynote speaker at the 1959 Chicago commemoration that I already showed you an image from, he's here in a pulpit, so to speak, provocatively declaring that religion was merely an adaptation. It's a Darwinian adaptation that humankind needs simply to get along with each other. It's very provocative, and indeed Julian Huxley seems to have become the remanifestation of his grandfather, calling to mind the fights of the 1860s, not the 1960s, the 1860s, in which Thomas Henry Huxley jousted with the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, at the meeting for the British Association for the Advancement of Science. So the Darwin that emerged at that time, in the 1960s, was very much a rational, secular biologist whose insights were very much alive in the minds of practicing biologists. So it's interesting to note that Darwin's personal integrity was frequently emphasized by these biologist biographers. Writers invariably referred to the dramatic moment in Darwin's life when Alfred Russel Wallace wrote him a letter from the Moluccas saying that he had a theory of evolution by natural selection, and would Darwin mind reading it and sending it on to Charles Lyell, who Wallace didn't know, and for publication. An astonishing moment for Darwin, because Wallace's essay seemed to recapitulate everything that Darwin had been thinking and writing about for 20 years. A huge and terrible shock for Darwin. The point that I'm going to make here is that the biographers, when they wish to address this moment in Darwin's life, speak very powerfully about Darwin's honorable behavior in response to this letter. And here I just want to separate what we think we know about Darwin, and we think we do know he's honorable, and how a biographer can express what they wish to say about Darwin. The biographers wish to show Darwin as an honorable figure. The letter from Wallace, which has never been found, was the stimulus for the double announcement of Darwin and Wallace's theories at the Linnaean Society of London in July 1858. Here is Wallace in Singapore, a couple of years after he had written to Darwin. And here is the joint, more strictly speaking, it's a double paper, because they didn't write it together. It's a double paper read by the secretary of the Linnaean Society in July 1858, and neither Wallace nor Darwin were there for various reasons, but it was the first announcement of evolution by natural selection. And the process that had brought the two men together to have this publication read has not very many records that can allow us to produce a story that we feel is probably true. There's plenty of room for this story to be interpreted in many different ways, and the biologists who were writing about Darwin wished to say that Darwin behaved very honorably. They show Darwin as a principled figure, committed to maintaining the ethical standards and responsibilities of the scientific world. Non-biological writers didn't have any such vested interests. They took aim at the saintly image. Gertrude Himmelfarb dethroned the icon by laying bare the social determinism in Darwin's writings, and she took a very jaundiced view of this ambiguous Darwin Wallace moment. Lauren Isley, the anthropologist and philosopher, a fascinating humanist writer who delivered Terry lectures here in 1966, he argued that Darwin failed to take moral responsibility for his theories, the theories that he put forward, and he suggested in a book called The Mysterious Mr. X that Darwin stole the concept of evolution by natural selection, not from Wallace, which he could have done, but from Edward Blythe, an early correspondent. Wallace biographers began to take the same line from the 1960s onwards, developing a richly complex Wallace conspiracy theory that still has legs today, that Wallace was undone by Darwin, and that Darwin wasn't honorable, that he stole some really quite key concepts from Wallace's essay that then turn up in The Origin of Species. I think it's groundless, but we all know conspiracy theories are very attractive, and there's no evidence to knock that one on the head. So at the same time, historians began to criticize the great man school of history. New standards were being created by a growing professional body of historians of science, and biography in general was increasingly regarded by scholars as an inappropriate form of inquiry for a scholarly discipline, although great fun to read outside. And I think the big biography by Irving Stone, that some of you may know, published in 1980, marks that transition. It is accurate, it's perceptive, it's well-paced, and yet it's never ever considered a scholarly contribution to Darwin's studies. With some very notable exceptions, it's taken more than 50 years for the genre to be re-established as a suitable vehicle for wider scholarly interpretations. And today, biographers work hard to reconstruct the world in which Darwin lived, the problems he tried to solve, the resources upon which he drew for answers, and the way that his ideas circulated and intermeshed with others far beyond his immediate environment. And this has meant dismantling the imagery of Darwin as an isolated thinker who independently revolutionized the Victorian worldview. And above all, modern writers are well aware of the other evolutionary writers of the period, and they're conscious of the problematic nature of claiming a solely Darwinian revolution, or even claiming a revolution at all. So to a large extent, modern biographers are dealing less with the science and more with the cultural features that create a scientist and the features that allow his or her views to become accepted, validated. So I've tried today, in conclusion, to speak about the hard-working, industrious Darwin of the 19th century through to the troubled evolutionist and secular thinker of the 1930s, to the biologist's Darwin of the 1950s and 60s. And I think it's clear that the key aspects of Darwin's character have been regularly reformulated by biographers. And this isn't really very surprising. Yet it's important to acknowledge that the people who wrote about Darwin were remembering the past, partly in order to think about their present. They inhabited a different memory world from Darwin and from each other and from us. These stories of a scientific life, I think, provide quite a bit of insight into those different memory worlds. In the words of my colleague at Harvard, Stephen Shapin, all of us inevitably write about the past as an expression of present concerns. And many of these concerns, I think, have been rooted in issues that I've discussed today, of which the religious beliefs of Darwin and his moral attributes were paramount. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very intriguing lecture. I wonder if you can just elaborate a little more on your last point and the religious and ethical concerns. But as you say, some of that was edited out. But the way he was struggling with his own religion, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you.
Darwin himself struggling about his religion. Such an interesting topic. Thank you. So he lived a long time and left a lot of papers so that one can find almost anything one wants to find in his papers and pull it out and say, well, that's the real Darwin. But actually there's a kind of spread of views. And like me, I don't want to assume what you're like, but he has different views at different times in his life. Different views when different things happened to him. So after the death of his daughter, he was distraught. Hated everything religious, but he still was friends with his pastor in the village, and he was friends with Huxley and other people who were much more secular. So he had different points of view at different times in his life. He's very clear that he lost all conventional faith in a gradual movement. He never had a moment of just turning his back on it, and that gradual process took place on the Beagle voyage. He wrote that he began the Beagle voyage with actually what he calls a laughable belief in the literal truth of the Bible, and that he spent several years on the Beagle, several moments during a lengthy Beagle voyage, wishing that there was some incontrovertible evidence that the testaments were true. So I don't suppose he really wanted to give it up, but he just lost it. And at the same time, he lost all sense that his profession would be that of a clergyman. When he joined the Beagle voyage, the ultimate plan was that he'd come back and become a clergyman. And that was gone. And his family and father acknowledged that. That went whilst he was on the ship. And they never seemed to have discussed it even. He was going to be a professional gentleman scientist with a private income. It's much more interesting and it gets much more engaged, and I won't go on too long about this, but through the 1860s, when people were deeply, deeply concerned about the implications of his writings, Darwin did discuss that at great length with a number of colleagues who he felt very intimate with. He didn't wish to make these discussions too widely known about. And it's clear that he's puzzled. He doesn't know about free will. He grapples with it. And he writes to his friend Lyell to say, I can't imagine that God requires every single sparrow, that God is looking after every single sparrow. So he has some issues that even we today can empathize with, and they're expressed in wonderfully simple language by a very intelligent man that I think speaks to some of us. And so those people who have read the unexpurgated autobiography and Darwin's correspondence on religious matters find him humane, thoughtful, anxious, unwilling to take a position, reluctant to give it all up because who knows, and yet he doesn't go to church. He can't bear that. He looks at the word of the baptismal service. He was asked to be a godfather to some little cousins of his, and he had to write to his cousin to say, I can't do this. I'm not going to say that. I think it's absurd that the child should be sinful before it's baptized. So there's interesting things in the materials.
I'm interested in the notion of all this emphasis upon virtue and hard work. And I'm wondering if that also wasn't a response to Darwin's loss of religious belief. In other words, following the Nietzschean and Dostoevskian notion that if there's no God, everything's permitted. This could be a way also of dealing with the fact that if there is no God, there is an inherent goodness or morality in man that still is there. Could you address that intellectual development?
That's such an interesting question. Thank you. Did you all hear it? That surely when you lose your faith, in order to remain a decent member of society, there have to be other things that you call on. And Darwin certainly called on that. So we know he wrote, it was to his wife. He wrote to say, at least I know my duty. And you can see that he's saying, I'm not a bad man because I might have lost some of this faith. I know what to do. I know what's decent. I know what's moral. I'm a virtuous person. So yes, I think it's a real moment in religious history where the kind of key concepts of evangelicalism are lifted and put into a secular environment, which the gentleman I spoke about, Boyd Hilton, I mentioned his name, wrote a wonderful book called The Age of Atonement, in which that thesis is presented. So that everyone's being very moral, but it's not necessarily with religious motivation behind it. Thank you.
I'm interested in the role of Thomas Henry Huxley and his promotion of Darwin's ideas and his debating of Darwin's ideas. To what extent was Huxley's work in educating people about Darwin's ideas and debating them independent, and to what extent was it a collaboration? How much did Darwin work with Huxley on this?
Thank you. So some of you will know that Huxley was sometimes ambivalent about Darwin's ideas. There was a particular issue in Darwinism, as Darwin presented it, that Huxley really could not adopt, which was what Huxley calls the species barrier, that as well-adapted organisms become more and more differentiated through preserving adaptations, at some point they have to stop interbreeding with each other if they're going to turn into new species. And it's that moment that Huxley couldn't fathom. He couldn't see how Darwin wanted to do that. So Huxley insisted there had to be some thing that pushed the species away at that last moment, which Darwin didn't approve of. So they talk a great deal to each other about this and other things. And Huxley took Darwinism as a banner for freedom of thought, for rationality, for progress. It was the best idea he thought had come up in that period. It was the best theory possible for uniting all the biological facts together. So he was deeply committed to Darwinism with some tweaks that he thought could be made that weren't being made. And he, amongst others, was very active in showing how this isn't just a theory about species origination. This is a whole new restructuring of biology, about the way humans think about themselves and our place in the world, and about the relationship of science to the church and to the other institutions of the age. So Huxley is a big part of that Darwinian revolution. If we're going to call it a revolution, we should call it the Huxleyan revolution, because it's Huxley who does it. Darwin's sitting at home writing letters. But there's a lot of interaction between them, but they don't cook up a program of political propagandizing together. But Darwin's really glad that Huxley will do that, because Darwin's not going to do it.
I was wondering if you see some psychological tension, having produced the theory of evolution and then needing to, well, that's enough. I don't want to rock the boat that much. I need to have this moral uprightness. He did not want to further radicalize his life, shall we say. Does it seem as though there's that bit of tension in his need to be a moral person and so forth?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I've never thought of it in quite the way that you're formulating it. I think he was such a man beforehand, so that it's not he doesn't have to adopt a way of being a good person after the origin of species. He was that person already. But the book itself, The Origin of Species, when it was published, transformed his life, so that not only was there masses and masses of correspondence to deal with, people came to visit, people wished to know all kinds of intimate things about him, particularly his religious views. And his friends would be writing to say, well, I was at such and such a meeting, and X kind of shot you down, and Y had something to say about it. So there's a lot going on in his life relating to the book that is transformative. But I don't believe that he becomes more obviously moral or decent or upright any more than he would have been if he hadn't written it, I think. Thank you.
You mentioned how the themes in the history of biography of Darwin often reflect the uses of Darwin. And I remember there was a recent work on the growth of an atheism in France in particular that becomes non-humanist between the wars. And I'm wondering if you see in biography or elsewhere this sort of way that how this may change the uses of Darwin away from Darwin as this sort of regretful person towards people like the new atheists today and that sort of thing.
There are certainly books about Darwin, thank you, where Darwin's pictured as reveling in being secular. But they're rather unusual books. Mostly the books that I've come across in the last 50 years when I've been reading them all is Darwin as a tentative thinker, which I find strange because he's absolutely incisive when he's thinking about biological issues. But for some of the other things that involve social questions and questions of culture and humanity and human progress, he's much more tentative and much more confused, which is why perhaps people don't always feel quite so happy about reading The Descent of Man, that last book of Darwin's, because it's not the Darwin that they think they're going to get. So he thinks deeply about things, and then he finds actually he's not able to answer quite a few of the questions he's asking himself. Yes, thank you. Are we?